Okay, excellent. So we had some questions from this first chapter. This was, of course, the oldest information, so people had the most questions about it. And there was this question, why was the Byzantine Empire able to last so much longer than the Western Roman Empire? And also there was a question about this guy, Justinian. So I will take, I'm going to actually go back to some of the old slides to discuss those two questions. So the Byzantine Empire, first of all, remember the Byzantine Empire is remember the Roman Empire got really, really big. And so it wasn't just centered on Rome anymore, it actually made it all the way to what's like modern day Turkey. So it got really, really big. And the western half fell. The western half of the Roman Empire fell in 476. But the eastern half, the Greek Orthodox half, the Christian, Greek Orthodox Christian half, made it for another 1,000 years. And while the Western Roman Empire was busy falling apart, this guy Justinian was actually even building up the Byzantine Empire, making it even stronger. So it was really flourishing while the Western Roman Empire was falling. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek Eastern or Orthodox Christian part of the empire, was growing. And Justinian was so powerful, this Byzantine emperor, he actually attempted to reconquer the West. He formed his own law code, which influenced Europe for over 1,000 years. And he built this magnificent church, you'll remember, the Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom. So we need to understand these Byzantine people, they're the continuation of the Western Roman Empire. They're Christian, but they're Greek Orthodox Christians. They're not Roman Catholic Christians. They're not like Charlemagne, they're a different kind of Christian.
So, it was because Justinian was building them up?
Well, right, the main thing, they're flourishing. They're still doing well. In terms of the question, so that's who Justinian is, and that's who the Byzantine Empire is. In terms of the question, why do they last so long? Oops. It's right here on this slide. Why do they hold out so long? A big thing is wealth. Remember, this is the wealthier, richer part of the empire. So a major thing is their wealth. They have the money to train and fund soldiers. That's very helpful. If you want to maintain your empires, you have to have a good economy that can support soldiers. Another important aspect was their strategic location. Right? It was very difficult to actually take Constantinople, their key city, their central city. And this helped them to maintain their empire, the fact that they had this capital that no one could really take over. So that was a major benefit. I don't have the slide here, but if you go back to that old lesson, I showed you pictures of their walls. The city of Constantinople not only was in a major strategic location, it also had a very powerful system of walls that protected it. And finally, remember the Greeks had, the Byzantine Greeks had Greek fire, which was like a flamethrower. There I showed you the picture of the guys on the boat showering flames on their enemies. I mean, that's a pretty good weapon, and that helped them to maintain their power. And this is important because they're being attacked by all these different people. They're being attacked by the Huns, by the Persians, and after 632, they're fighting Muslims who are always trying to take them over. And in the end, it will be Muslims who defeat them, but that's not till the 15th century. Now, the next section, the next question was, what do Western, that is Catholic, and Eastern, that is Orthodox Christianity, have in common? Why did they split? And that's also connected, to this guy, Cyril. So I'm going to go back to the slide. Wrong way. Go back to the slides and talk about them. Okay, that's a picture of Cyril there on the left. Cyril was an Orthodox Christian missionary. He was an Orthodox Christian missionary. So when you think Cyril, think Orthodox Christian. And he was the one who converted the Russians. He converted the Russians to Orthodox Christianity. Like I said, his name was Cyril. And that's why we call the Russian alphabet Cyrillic. He's basically the guy that invented it. So that's who Cyril is. He's a missionary who converted the Russians to Christianity, but especially Orthodox Christianity. Now, in terms of the similarities and differences, there are some theological similarities between Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians. For example, the Orthodox and the Catholics both practice confession. They believe you should confess your sins to a priest. And that's what's happening in these images. They also believe that at communion, that the blood, or the wine and the bread and the wine here, actually become the body and blood of Christ. To them, it's not just a symbol. It actually literally becomes his body and blood. So that's something that they share. But you'll also recall that there's some important differences between them. I don't expect you to remember all this, but in terms of authority, the Catholics believe in the Pope. The Orthodox don't. Right? The Catholics believe in a Pope. The Orthodox don't. And that's one of the big difficulties for reunion between them, is for the Orthodox to unify with the Catholics, they would have to accept the Pope's authority, and many of them don't want to. In addition, their language is different. The Catholics primarily use Latin. The Orthodox primarily use Greek or Russian. The Catholics had this doctrine of original sin, whereas the Orthodox don't. And so you had religious differences. There are important religious similarities, but there's also important differences. And these doctrinal differences combined with politics. Remember, there's this marriage between church and state. If you convert to Catholicism and you become a Catholic country, that strengthens the Catholics. If you convert to Orthodoxy and become an Orthodox country, that strengthens the Orthodox countries like the Byzantine Empire. So there's a combination of politics and doctrine that causes division between these two. Right? They believe different things. They believe some things that are the same, but their differences are enough to divide them. And those differences are also connected to politics, and that helps to divide them further. And because of that, I don't expect you to remember this, they split formally in 1054, and they're still not united despite nice gestures where they meet and talk to each other. So any questions about that?
So why did they split?
Why do they split? It's religious reasons. These are examples of religious reasons, but also political reasons. But it's important to remember that despite those differences, there's a lot of similarities in their theology. And I think, yes, that covers those four, that chapter. Any other questions about that? Yes, Miriam. Or Brianna, sorry.
You said they split because of religious reasons
And political reasons. And also remember, despite the political differences, despite the religious differences, there's also important similarities. Right? There's not only just differences, there's also important similarities. And I gave that example with these slides here. Right? They both have confession, and they both have communion in the same way. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. So, okay, notice that people had a lot of questions about the Islamic world. And I will go a little quickly through this. If I go too fast, please raise your hand and let me know if I go too fast. So, what was the Arabic society like before the rise of Islam? Remember, what was the key word I kept using? Begins with a D. Division.
Yeah, division.
Right, division. Right, there was divisions between the people who lived in the desert and the people who lived in the towns. And there were also divisions between the different tribes. Remember, there are all these different Muslim tribes. I'm sorry, not Muslim tribes. There's all these different Arabic tribes. And each one of them had their own god. And each large family had its own god. And remember, who you worship helps to identify who you are. So that creates more divisions. Okay, it's a family division, it's a religious division. So lots and lots of division in pre-Arabic society. Yes, Miriam?
Each tribe had what?
Its own god. Each tribe has its own god. So that's the key word I'm looking for, is this kind of division. Now the next question, why is Mecca important? What's in Mecca that makes it important? Right, the Kaaba. I heard it, the Kaaba. This thing.
Could you spell that?
The Kaaba. Remember, the Kaaba is a shrine that people believed was built by Abraham. And it houses this special rock that is probably a meteorite, likely fell from the sky. That's why people thought it was holy. And that's what makes Mecca holy, was it has this Kaaba. This Kaaba means cube. It's this cube-shaped shrine. And that's why Muslims face Mecca when they pray, because they're facing the Kaaba, this holy shrine. Let's see. What are the characteristics of the Quran? Oops. Okay, here's this slide again. So remember, Muslims believe that the Quran is the written form of God's revelations, right? It's like a Bible to them. And some of these initially were written down, some were just memorized, but eventually they're all written down, and in 651 put into an authoritative version, which is in Arabic. Right? Remember the language. This is growing up in an Arabian society. Muhammad was an Arab. So the book, the Quran is in Arabic. And it's important to stress, when it's written down in Arabic, that's not just his interpretation of God's word. The Quran is also, Muslims believe, written in heaven on golden plates in Arabic as well. So there's no human intervention here. This is God speaks Arabic. He had the revelation Arabic. Therefore, the Quran is written in Arabic. And it's also important to stress that this is understood to be a miracle. Muhammad didn't perform any miracles, and people challenged him and said, hey, you're a prophet. Prophets perform miracles. And he said, my miracle is the Quran. The Quran itself is the miracle. So it's understood that this pure revelation of God, Muslims themselves see that as a miracle. And also, just as a reminder, remember, Islam is the religion. A Muslim is a follower of the religion. Islam is to Christianity what Muslim is to Christian. Right? You remember those when you had to take SATs and things like that. A Muslim is a follower of Islam. Muslims are people, Islam is the religion. So let's see. Okay, what difficulties, and people have pointed out to me, 4 and 5 are a little similar in some ways, so I'll try to make the differences clear. So what difficulties did the early Muslim community face? It's very similar to what the early Christian community faced. What did they face? Right, they were killed? Right, exactly. They faced persecution. Right, they could be killed. People were mean to them. They had trouble. Muslims and Christians both faced persecution. But they dealt with these things differently. Remember, the Christians basically just developed this concept of martyrdom, and they put up with persecution for a few hundred years, and then Constantine wins his battle and they get tolerated. Remember though, what do Muslims do? What does Muhammad do? Yeah, exactly. He fought back. Muslims used violence to defend themselves. And when I say the word violence, I'm not saying that's wrong or right. Violence can be legitimate or illegitimate, but they fought back, and it worked. Right? Through the effective use of violence, Muslims obtained tolerance and then dominance. So that's one reason I try to emphasize that. If we want to understand Islam today, it's important to remember that in the past, violence worked very well to protect their community. So it's logical that if Muslims feel threatened today, that they may look back to what they experienced and say, okay, violence will work here to protect our community.
So,
yes, Courtney.
So that's how they use violence to overcome?
Exactly. Violence overcomes those difficulties. The difficulty is they're persecuted. What overcomes those difficulties is violence. Now the question, how did Islam bring unity? That goes back to number 1. Right? Remember, Arabic society is divided into different clans and tribes, and those divisions are encouraged by each one of these families and tribes believing in a different God. So Muhammad says, okay, I worship a God who's bigger than those family and tribal gods, and you should worship that God. And that allows people to unite. They're worshiping a God bigger than their family. Remember, who you worship determines who you are. So you worship a God bigger than your family, that transcends the family. So whereas once you had all these people divided up, you had family A, you had family B, you had family C, you had family D, and they each worship they each worship God A, B, C, and D. Muhammad says, no, those aren't real gods. You should all worship Allah. And then that destroys the divisions between those families. And they all become Muslims. Right, so belief in this one big God that transcends all those little gods that the families worship, that changes these people's identities. So instead of them thinking, oh, I'm primarily a member of this clan or this tribe, they think of themselves as Muslims first. Of course, it brings new kinds of divisions because now you have a big Islamic empire that's going to fight with the Christian and the other empires as well. So it's going to lead to new divisions between these major religions. Okay, this next question is a little complex. I want to write on the board for it so it makes it a little clearer, I hope. So this question, what differences divide Sunni and Shia Muslims? So it helps to kind of divide this with the terms. We have Sunni Muslims on one side, and we have Shia Muslims on the other side. So first of all, now you'll notice someone asked about this guy Abu Bakr. I think that's important. Would you put Abu Bakr on the Sunni side or the Shia side?
Sunni.
Sunni, yes. Abu Bakr, he connects to the Sunni. And the terms up here, Abu Bakr was a, what? Caliph, yes. Abu Bakr was a caliph. And a caliph is the... Right, but he's the... Begins with an S? Successor. Right, he's a successor to Muhammad. Right, he's the guy who, he's like an emperor because Muhammad had political power, but he's also a religious leader. Right, so he is, the caliph is someone who has the successor of Muhammad and therefore has a political and a religious role. And Abu Bakr is going to be the first caliph. He's the first successor to Muhammad. Who is, if we then put the guy next to him, Ali, where does he go on this? Right, he goes under Shia. He's the guy that Shia Muslims think should have been the first caliph. Right, Sunni Muslims look at Abu Bakr. Sunni Muslims, these guys up here, look at Abu Bakr and say, this guy's great. He's the first caliph. All caliphs should be like him. He's an awesome guy. Shia people look at Abu Bakr and they don't like him. Right? Shia people look at him and say, Abu Bakr is a bad guy. Why is he a bad guy? Ali was supposed to be caliph. Ali was supposed to be caliph, and Abu Bakr plotted against him, and so Ali did not become caliph. So already you have a division there, right? They disagree about who should be the first caliph. It's also important because the reason they disagreed over this, Sunni Muslims believe that the first caliph should be chosen by the Muslim community. Right? Sunni Muslims believe that the caliph should be chosen by the Muslim community. Shia Muslims believe should be Muhammad's kin. Right? Ali was married to Muhammad's daughter, and their children would have been Muhammad's blood relatives. So the Shia think that the caliph should come from those blood relatives. So they disagree over who should have been the first caliph, and they disagree over who should choose the caliph. In addition, they disagree in terms of doctrine. Right? Remember, the successor is supposed to tell Muslims what they should believe. The caliph should help Muslims determine what they as Muslims should believe. The Sunni think that the community as a whole should decide what Muslims believe. The community as a whole should decide what Muslims believe. In Shia, there's this guy called the Imam. He's kind of like a Muslim pope. And he decides what Muslims should believe. Right? So you can see, I just want to point out, right? You see several terms all connected here, right? Caliph, Sunni, Shiite, or I'm sorry, Shia, and Abu Bakr and Ali. So that's something to kind of think about. Now they disagree, Sunni and Shia disagree over the caliph, who should be the first caliph, and how the caliph should be selected, whether he should be selected by community or by kin. Also, they disagree about how you should determine what Muslims should believe. Is it either the community coming to a consensus, or is it this guy called the imam? And one thing I should also remind you of is that the Sunnis assassinated Ali. They got rid of him. So that also makes them kind of angry. They kill each other. So that's why not too friendly today. So any questions about that? That one was a little complex. Okay. So the next question, how was slavery viewed in Islam? And one kind of theme, remember I'm always trying to tell you like a story. And the story I'm trying to tell you in a large part with Islam is how Muslims are different. Right? You don't want to think of all Muslims are the same. Islam differs depending on the time and place. And also Islam is complex. People say Muslims do this, Muslims do that. Well, I want to try and make it a little more complex. So how slavery was viewed in Islam, it was complex. Now, on one side, Muhammad said, slaves are the children of Allah. You have to treat them with a certain amount of respect. And you cannot make a Muslim a slave. If someone is a Muslim, you cannot make them a slave. And like I said, you have to treat slaves with respect. And I gave the example that in pre-Islamic times, it was acceptable in Arabian society to make a woman who was a slave be a prostitute. When Muhammad came to power, he said you can't do that. You can't force a slave woman to be a prostitute. That's wrong. So he thought that you had to treat slaves with a certain amount of respect, and he also thought you can't make other Muslims slaves. However, the key thing is he also thought that slavery was acceptable. He didn't like it, and he freed many of his own slaves, but he still owned slaves. He still had slaves. So he, like I said, it's complex. On one side, Muhammad said, we need to treat slaves well. On the other side, he said, well, it's you can have them as long as you treat them well. Okay, how did Islamic understandings of science and reason change over time? Now, this connects to a couple of terms. One of the terms it connects to is Abbasid. Right. Remember, the Abbasid was the caliphate. This is a caliphate. That means it's a group of caliphs who rule as a kind of dynasty. It's a caliphate, and I'm not going to expect you to remember the years exactly for the test, but it's 750 to 1298. The documentary we watched, the Islamic documentary we watched, was focusing on this caliphate. So this is the caliphate that we see as kind of the golden age of Islamic civilization. This caliphate is the golden age of Islamic civilization. This is when they're going to be making a lot of achievements, which is why I wanted you to remember the Abbasid caliphate in particular. So this is when they're going to be making a lot of achievements. It was during this time that science flourished in Islam. This is when Muslims are going to be, or I should say Islamic civilization is going to be making a lot of advances in science. Now I want you to pay, one thing I really want to stress when you review, sometimes my question, the way I ask the question in the review, gives you a clue as to what the proper answer should be. For example, on the last test I had a question, how did democracy strengthen Greece? I used almost the exact wording on the question, on one of the answers to the question on the test. I said, democracy strengthened the Greeks by X. So just by reviewing the question, you should have known the answer. Because there was only one that's told how Greeks strengthened. All the other ones talked about being weakened. Right? Does that make sense? I mean, so in this case, the question is, how did it change? So it means that it must have changed. So if there's a question on the test, if one of the answers on the test says it didn't change, that's definitely wrong, because the review sheet says, how does it change? So I just want to point that out. It's good to study the questions themselves as well as the answers. So it did change. During much of the Abbasid period, Muslims believed that science, reason, and faith went together just fine. They believed that science, reason, and faith went together just fine. And one person who did believe that, a Muslim philosopher that was respected by Europeans thought this guy was awesome, was this guy Averroes, who you'll notice is one of the terms. Right? Averroes was a guy who was really well respected, even by Europeans. And he took this idea that science was friendly to Islam, that reason and philosophy were friendly to Islam. However, this is the key thing, near the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, a group of Muslims who disagreed gained power. Muslims who disagreed with Averroes, who said that Averroes was wrong, gained power. They said that reason challenges faith. Right? Reason challenges faith. We shouldn't reason about God. God gave us his Quran. That's enough. And science presumes natural laws. Well, we can't talk about natural laws because natural laws would limit God's power. So these people, in order to defend their beliefs about God, said that science and religion don't go together. And they win. They beat people like Averroes. They win. And so what happens is, eventually, science declines in Islamic civilization. So during the early period, when they are friendly, Islam is friendly to science. Science does very well in Islamic civilizations. Later on, when Muslims who don't like science gain power, it declines. So any questions about that? Okay, what were some of the accomplishments of Islamic civilization? I think that question is directly taken from that documentary. So from the documentary, what did they do? Right, good with agriculture. They developed, they borrowed paper very quickly from China. They didn't invent paper. One thing I have to stress, the documentary made it sound like they invented it at first, but of course the Chinese invented it. But they developed paper. What else did they get? Lots of books, right. Paper allowed them to do lots of books. Excellent. Medicine, right. Medicine's a big one, right. They made major advances in medicine. Right. They made major advances in medicine. What else were they good at doing besides medicine and science? Textiles. Yeah, remember they made lots of beautiful cloth. In addition, they were also very good, you remember, with architecture. Right? They made some beautiful buildings, such as the mosque in Cordoba, and all these beautiful fountains and gardens and things that we saw in Baghdad. So let's see. So that brings us to how and why were the Christian and Muslims' conquests of Jerusalem different? Okay. In 1099, originally Jerusalem was part of the Byzantine Empire. It was under Christian control. I don't expect you to remember these years. I'm just giving them to you. In 1099, the Christians take Jerusalem. Right? The Christians take Jerusalem, and there's a massacre. Right? In 1099, the Christians take Jerusalem, and there's a massacre. The Christian crusaders kill many of the people in the city. And I had a problem with the documentary because the documentary implied it was because they were Christian. That's not completely accurate. The reason that there was a massacre was the city refused to surrender. The city refused to surrender. Right? In 1099, when they took the city, or the Crusaders said to the people in the city, surrender. The city said no. And under the rules of warfare at the time, if a city refused to surrender and you took the city, it was legitimate to kill the people because they had resisted you. I think, I'll have to look it up, the year's not important so much, but I think in 1196, the Muslims under Saladin's not on the terms list, so I'm just going to throw the name up there anyway. The Muslims will reconquer the city. They're going to reconquer the city. In this case, there is no massacre. Right? They don't massacre. And in the video, the documentary we saw, they presented that, and that's true. They didn't massacre the people. But that was problematic. The reason they didn't massacre the people was not so much because Saladin was a nice guy. It was because the city surrendered. Initially, Saladin wanted to massacre the people. But the Christians said, if you don't let us surrender, we will fight to the last man, we'll kill all our Muslim prisoners, and we'll destroy the Muslim holy sites. And only then did Saladin allow them to surrender, and they still had to pay him a lot of money. So the major difference, there was no massacre because when there was a massacre in 1099 because the city would not surrender. There was no massacre when the Muslims took it in 1096, primarily because they did surrender. So any questions there? Excellent. Whew. Let's see, Abu Bakr, Sunni, Shiite, Caliph, Abbasid, Sharia. Okay, Sharia is Islamic what? Law, right? It's Islamic religious law. Right? It's Islamic religious law. And you want to be very careful that you don't confuse Sharia with Hadith. Sometimes people get really close on the terms, but they don't quite get it right because they're just a little similar. What's Hadith? Right, it's oral traditions. Usually about Muhammad. And so when Muslims aren't sure what to believe sometimes, or if they're not sure how they should act in a particular situation. Exactly. Christians say, what would Jesus do? Muslims say, what would Muhammad do? Right? What would Muhammad do? So that's how they're trying to deal with this. So keep those two straight. Sharia means law. Islamic religious law. Hadith is referring to Islamic religious tradition. Excuse me. Hunayn is up here on this old slide. Hunayn was a Christian scholar of medicine who lived in a Muslim country. He lived under the Abbasids. And I wanted to stress in this that even though Islamic civilization makes a lot of advances in science, Muslims aren't the only scientists. There were also Christian scientists who helped with this. And one of them is this guy, Hunayn. He is a Christian scientist who's living under the Abbasid Caliphate and who's developing science and helping to develop Islamic science. Dhimmis are non-Muslims who live in Islamic societies. Hunayn was a dhimmi. Right? Hunayn was a dhimmi. They are tolerated. They are non-Muslims who are tolerated in Islamic societies so long as they pay a tax. They get tolerance, but they have to. There's a quid pro quo. They have to pay a tax to get that tolerance. Whew. That's always exhausting. Any questions on that? Laura.
Okay, Muslim and Islam. Are you asking the Muslims are followers?
You need to. Well, it's the same with any terms. I just want you to know what those terms are, and to know that if they're on that list, they could appear both in the matching and the triad. But right, primarily, Muslim is a person who follows the religion of Islam. Muslims are people. Islam is a religion. Okay, African societies and kingdoms. Why do we know comparatively little about early African civilizations other than Egypt? And the answer was these are primarily... Yes, thank you. Daijin? Yeah. Pre-literate. They're pre-literate societies, meaning they don't have reading, they don't have writing. So the problem is, since they don't have writing, we don't necessarily know all that much about them and what they're doing. We're reliant. We have to rely on, to deal with them, we have to rely on archaeological evidence, principally in Africa, cities. We rely a lot on cities to understand what's going on in Africa. Okay, so the Trans-Siberian, how do we say Siberian? I'm sorry, I study Asia, and the Trans-Siberian Railroad is very important. I don't mean Trans-Siberian, I mean Trans-Saharan trade. Right? The Trans-Saharan trade. That's important for basically two reasons. It connects Africa to other places in the world. Remember, it connects them to Europe and to the Middle East, especially to the Middle East. And that allows Africans to sell their goods, primarily gold, and to a lesser extent slaves, on the international market. So it connects them they're able to trade internationally. But also remember, that's how Islam first comes to Africa. Islam comes to Africa through the Trans-Saharan trade. Islam and trade, or Islam and gold, you can kind of think of the answer to this. Now, what made it possible? The camel. Right? The domestication of the camel made this possible. How were the Bantu kingdoms similar to those of other early civilizations? Remember the Bantu kingdoms? Those were the ones. First of all, one thing I just want to stress, Bantu, it's up here. Bantu is a language group. It's a group of languages. So similar to when we talk about Romance languages and Germanic languages in Europe, there's also different language groups in Africa. Bantu is a language spoken primarily, or Bantu is a language group primarily from West Africa. And I talked about these Bantu kingdoms. And these Bantu kingdoms typically have they're similar to some of the early civilizations we studied, such as Babylonia or Egypt, in the sense that there's a close relationship between the king and religion. There's a close relationship in these civilizations between the king and religion. Just as sometimes people claim the pharaoh was divine, they also at times claim that these Bantu kings were divine. So they're using religion to help them rule. What are the characteristics of Ethiopian religion? Do you remember that video we watched on Ethiopian religion?
Holy honey?
Yep, holy honey. Right? They had the holy honey. And the thing I was looking about with the holy honey was, in particular, that God can make physical things holy. Right? God can make physical things holy. Right? So they had the holy honey. What else did they have? Justin? Yeah, they carved their churches out of mountains, which I thought was kind of cool. Do you remember the angels? What was the deal with the angels? I'm sorry? Right, there was an idea that the angels were there to protect you, right? So that they had this belief in angels, just like other Christians. But there was something that was a little different about their angels than European angels. Right, exactly. So they believed that the angels that were going to protect them were black angels. And this shows their African characteristics. Right? This is African Christianity. It's clearly Christian, but it's also clearly African. And let's see. And do you remember also when they went to get the holy honey, what was the priest doing? Remember, there was a priest. He was doing something before they went in. He was reading from an Ethiopian Bible. They have their own language, their own written language. So this was, remember, Ethiopia was a little different. We know more about the Ethiopians than other African civilizations because they developed their own writing. And that connects them. I just want to point out these three terms here, Mansa Musa. I'm sorry, not Mansa Musa. Menelik and the Glory of Kings are both connected, and they both connect to Ethiopia. Right? The Glory of Kings tells the story of Menelik. The Glory of Kings tell the story of Menelik. And remember, who's Menelik's dad? Solomon. Who's Menelik's mom? Queen of Sheba. Yeah, exactly. Menelik is the son of Solomon and the son of the Queen of Sheba. And that means on one side, on the Queen of Sheba's side, that makes him an Ethiopian. Through Solomon's side, he's a Hebrew, and he's connected to the line of David. And God said that there will always be someone on the throne of David. So the Ethiopian kings, the Ethiopian emperors, justified their right to rule. Why are you king? I'm the great grandson of David. Through Solomon, Queen of Sheba, and Menelik. So they justified the right to rule through the story of the Glory of Kings and Menelik, by connecting themselves to King David. Okay. What does the capital of Great Zimbabwe tell us about that civilization? Remember, that was another one that was based off a cliff. What do you remember about? Remember that big city? What do you remember about the city?
There's a lot of bricks.
Right, they had built all these brick walls. Right, remember the bricks? They had that one wall had like 1 million bricks in it, and they cut each one very carefully. And so this shows their kind of technological advancement. But also those bricks divided up the city into different areas. There's one area for the king, one area for the servants, one area for the priests. So they had a socially differentiated society. They had different classes in their society. So they had an advanced, complex society. And of course, like I said, they're technologically, they have some technology because they know how to build those things. And where did they get the wealth to build those things? This was where did they get money from? Right, this was a trading city. Right, they were particularly wealthy in gold. Did this trade stay in Africa? No, international trade. Remember, they were trading with China, with India. So this connects them to other places. And key thing, where were the people from who built this city? Right, they were Africans. Africans built the city. Right, Africans were capable of building really amazing civilizations. It's just a lot of them didn't have writing, so we don't have a lot of records about them. Oops. Okay, so. No, that's not. I apologize. It's a new clicker. Wow. Okay. So I also have these three terms, and they're connected: Mali, Timbuktu, and Mansa Musa. Remember, Mali is a great African trading empire. Remember, this is an empire that traded a lot of gold and a lot of slaves. So this is a very important trading empire. Remember, it's also an Islamic empire. Right? It's an Islamic empire. So, and you may recall I made this comparison in Europe. You know, a lot of the warrior kings, the kings were usually warriors, didn't know how to read and write. It was similar in these places. So whereas the European kings turned to the church for education and monks, African kings often turned to Islam because Muslims knew how to read and write and knew how to do government. And many of them converted to Islam. So Mali is one of these great African trading empires that was also an Islamic civilization. One of its capital was this city, Timbuktu. And Timbuktu was a center of trade and a center of Islam. There was a great university built at Timbuktu that helped to spread Islam. So these two things are kind of connected. So you want to remember that Timbuktu is a center of trade and of Islam. You also had this guy, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa. He was a king. I'm sorry, he was the king of the emperor of Mali. So he was an emperor of Mali, richest man in the world at the time because he had huge amounts of gold. Right, exactly. He had huge amounts of gold. That's where he got his wealth from. And he's the guy that he went to on a Hajj. He was also a Muslim. He went on a Hajj, a pilgrimage to Mecca. And on his way, he hung around in Egypt. And he spent so much gold in Egypt that the price of gold went down. So, very rich man. So, any questions there? So, number one, what are the principal archaeological remains of North American Indian civilizations? It's right here. Mississippian mounds. Mississippian mounds. Right? A lot of the North American Indians had basically a tribal level society. They didn't have reading and writing, so they were limited in the kind of things that they could develop in terms of their in terms of records that we know about them. But what we do know about them a lot of times is based on the Mississippian mounds. Okay, so how was Aztec society organized? In many ways, the central institution of Aztec society was religion. Right? One of the main central aspects of Aztec society was religion. And what stands out about Aztec religion? What do they do that most people don't do? Human sacrifice, right. And how did you get, for the most part, how did you get people to sacrifice?
Well, you captured them in the war.
Right. Exactly. And that means, in addition to priests being very important, warriors are very important in Aztec society. Right? If a warrior captured 4 prisoners, if a warrior captures 4 prisoners for human sacrifice, that warrior becomes a noble. Right? That warrior becomes a noble. And if you're a noble, you can serve as a government official. If you're noble, you can serve as a government official. So that's kind of the main thing I want you to understand about Aztec society. Now, the problem, why they did it, of course, there's kind of 2 major reasons why they did it. One was that they thought that if they didn't practice human sacrifice, the world will end. The world will be destroyed. Trying to prevent the destruction of the world sounds like a pretty good reason to me to do something. So they had a theological reason, right? They wanted to feed the gods so that the gods could keep alive, could keep around, and they could keep the world going. If you stop doing this, maybe the world's going to end. So that's another reason. But also remember that they were trying to trying to maintain their empire. And a lot of their people they sacrificed came through war, other people they sacrificed were from the people they conquered. If they conquered your country, they would demand that you send them sacrifice victims. So they used fear of being sacrificed, as a way to hold together their empire. Right? They used human sacrifice and the fear that sacrifice encouraged to hold together their empire. Don't mess with the Aztecs, they'll sacrifice you. Don't rebel against the Aztecs, they'll sacrifice you. And remember, they played this up, right? When they did the sacrifice, it was very messy, it was very bloody. They had skull racks everywhere. It was meant to scare you. Now, the problems it caused is that meant that many people who were under Aztec rulership didn't particularly like the Aztecs. So when the Spanish come, they're going to join with the Spanish and help them to defeat the Aztecs. So it's going to make people not support their empire. You know, if you became in Roman days, if you joined the Roman Empire, you got aqueducts, you got roads, you got to be a citizen. It could be a fairly good deal. With the Aztecs, it's either join us or we're going to sacrifice you. So they don't give you that much. And the last section, what were the limits to Mongol rule? That was that last slide we or one of the last slides we ended with. You'll remember, and this goes to this guy Kublai Khan. In some places, you had this guy Kublai Khan. And he conquered China. He conquered China, and he ruled China as part of what we call the Yuan dynasty. So he conquers China and rules it as part of the so-called Yuan dynasty. So that's, so he conquers it as part of the Yuan dynasty. Now, one thing about the Yuan dynasty, it doesn't last very long. Most Chinese dynasties, we talked about, last 200-300 years. That's pretty good. The Yuan dynasty lasted less than 100 years. It didn't last very long. The reason was because the Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty rejected Chinese culture. They rejected Chinese culture. So they remained foreign. They remained foreign because they're rejecting Chinese culture. So Chinese people said, we're tired of being ruled by these foreigners. We don't want to be ruled by them anymore. So we're going to rebel and we're going to get rid of these foreigners. And so that's why their dynasty lasts less than 100 years. Here's a related slide. So in this case, they chose to remain separate. The Yuan dynasty Mongols under Kublai Khan chose to remain separate from the Chinese people. They rejected Chinese culture, and therefore they were seen as foreigners, and therefore they were overthrown. On the other hand, some Mongols took over Islamic countries. This area, Central Asia, is Islamic. This area is Islamic. The Mongols in these places became Muslim and intermarried with the population. And so over time, they disappeared. The Mongols just blended in with the other people, and they just became like them. So they didn't have any, so their rules stopped being Mongol. There was nothing Mongolian about it. So if they stayed Mongols, they eventually got overthrown because they were foreigners. If they stopped being Mongols, if they assimilated, if they became like the people they conquered, they just disappear. And you can't say they rule anymore because they don't exist as a unified, separate ethnic group. So that answered all the questions people had. I'm just going to go through the review slides one more time if anyone wants to add a question. So, going once, twice. Laura. Maya?
Yeah.
Maya, okay. So the Maya. The Maya are a civilization in Mesoamerica. Remember, the Maya had a couple things about them. Remember, are they more like the Romans or more like the Greeks? Right, I heard the Greeks. Remember, the Mayans are not a single empire. They're divided into multiple city-states that fight with each other, like the Greeks. The other thing we want to remember about the Mayas, too many M's. One thing we have to remember about the Mayas also is that, remember, they were very religious people. They also practiced human sacrifice. And if you're a religious person, you have holy days. But to figure out when your holy days are, you have to have a calendar. To have a calendar, you need math. So they were also expert mathematicians. They were very good at math in order to determine when their holy days were. Right? So religion needs a calendar needs math, so they developed math. So they were really smart. Despite only having Stone Age technology, they were able to become very good mathematicians. Once, twice. I don't think there's I did all the questions on Africa. Once, twice. Oops. Okay, we did all the questions here. Okay, I'll send out the YouTube link. You all have a good day. Good luck. Get plenty of sleep. And I'll see you all on Wednesday.